I stared into those familiar emerald eyes, realizing with a sudden suffocating jolt that the girl who used to share my juice boxes now held my entire heart in the palm of her hand, and she didn't even know my name. Welcome to the channel. If you love this kind of story and want to see what happens in the next parts, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Your support helps me bring more amazing stories to life. Now, let's get into the story. Part 1, The Stranger I've Always Known. The autumn breeze sweeping across the sprawling campus of Eastwood University carried the crisp scent of pine needles and burnt sugar from the local coffee carts. For me, Olivia, my sophomore year was supposed to be about maintaining my 4.0 GPA, drinking an unhealthy amount of iced lattes, and maybe, just maybe, figuring out my completely non-existent love life. I had finally settled into a comfortable routine. The awkward, brace-faced, relentlessly bullied girl I used to be in middle school was entirely gone. Back then, everyone called me Ollie. I was all scraped knees, oversized graphic tees, and thick glasses. Now at 19, I was Olivia, confident, stylish, and happily thriving in my own skin. I was sitting in my favorite spot in the middle row of my advanced creative writing seminar, casually tapping my pen against my notebook. The lecture hall was buzzing with the usual Monday morning chatter. My best friend and roommate, Chloe, was sitting next to me, rambling on about a party she wanted us to attend this weekend, but my mind was wandering. It usually did around this time of year. Autumn always brought back a very specific, lingering ache in my chest. It was the season my childhood best friend had moved away. Her name was Emma. We had been completely inseparable since we were 4 years old. Our houses were right next to each other, our bedroom windows perfectly aligned so we could pass notes attached to a string across the narrow gap between our homes. She was my first friend, my fierce protector, and, looking back with the clarity of adulthood, my very first crush. Emma was a force of nature even back then. When we were 12, her parents got divorced, and her mother abruptly relocated them across the country to California. We promised to write, we promised to call, but time and distance are cruel thieves. Over the span of 7 years, the calls faded, the letters stopped, and Emma became a beautiful, bittersweet memory locked away in the back of my mind. Olivia? Earth to Olivia. Chloe snapped her fingers playfully in front of my face, pulling me out of my nostalgic days. Sorry, I blinked, offering a sheepish smile. Just zoned out for a second. What were you saying about the party? Before Chloe could answer, the heavy wooden doors of the lecture hall swung open, and the low hum of student chatter instantly died down. Our professor, Mr. Harrison, walked in, setting his leather briefcase onto the podium. But he wasn't alone. Following closely behind him was a girl who instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. Time seemed to completely freeze. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. She had long, effortlessly wavy chestnut hair that tumbled over her shoulders, and she moved with a quiet, undeniable grace. She was wearing a vintage leather jacket over a simple white slip dress, paired with scuffed combat boots. It was an aesthetic that screamed effortless cool. But it wasn't her clothes that made my heart slam against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was her face. The soft curve of her jaw, the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, and those eyes. Those unmistakable, piercing emerald green eyes. Everyone, settle down, please, Professor Harrison announced, adjusting his glasses. Before we begin today's lecture on narrative structure, I'd like to introduce a new transfer student who is joining our program. She just moved here from the West Coast. Please make her feel welcome. This is Emma Davis. Emma. The name hit me like a physical blow. 1,000 memories rushed through my mind in a split second, building pillow forts in my living room, sharing headphones on the school bus, the time she pushed a boy into the mud because he made fun of my glasses. It was her. My Emma. Except she wasn't mine anymore, and she certainly wasn't the scrawny 12-year-old girl I remembered. She was breathtakingly gorgeous, radiating a quiet, magnetic confidence that made my palms instantly begin to sweat. Hi everyone, Emma said, her voice a little deeper than I remembered, smooth and melodic. She offered the class a polite, guarded smile. "There's an empty seat right there in the third row next to Olivia." Professor Harrison pointed his pen directly at the empty chair to my right. Panic, hot and immediate, flared up my spine. Out of all the 50 seats in this massive hall, she had to sit next to me. I wanted to sink into the floor. I wanted to run out the door. More than anything, I wanted to leap out of my chair and throw my arms around her. I remained completely frozen as she walked up the carpeted steps, her boots making a soft, rhythmic thud that seemed to sync with my racing heartbeat. She stopped next to the desk, sliding her canvas tote bag onto the floor. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, turning to look at me. I looked up, bracing myself for the moment of recognition. I waited for her eyes to widen, for the gasp of surprise, for her to scream "Ollie" and pull me into a hug. I stared directly into her emerald eyes, laying my soul bare, waiting for my childhood best friend to see me. But the flash of recognition never came. Her gaze was polite, casual, and entirely blank. She was looking at me the way you look at a complete stranger at a bus stop. There was no spark. No memory. Nothing. "No," I managed to choke out, my voice sounding incredibly small to my own ears. It's free. Go ahead." "Thanks," she murmured, pulling out the chair and sitting down gracefully. She took out a sleek black notebook and a pen, immediately turning her attention toward the professor as he began to write on the whiteboard. I sat there, utterly paralyzed, processing the crushing reality of the situation. She didn't recognize me. Not even a little bit. To be fair, I had changed drastically. The glasses were replaced by contacts. The braces were gone, leaving behind a perfectly straight smile. My hair was styled differently, my fashion sense had completely evolved, and I had grown a few inches. Even my name was different, nobody called me Ollie anymore. I was a completely different person from the awkward kid she had left behind. But still, a small, irrational part of my heart shattered. How could you share your entire childhood with someone? How could you hold so many of their secrets, only for them to look at you and see an absolute stranger? For the next hour, I didn't hear a single word Professor Harrison said. All of my senses were hyper-focused on the girl sitting mere inches to my right. I could smell her perfume, something earthy and sweet like vanilla and sandalwood. I could see the subtle way she chewed on the end of her pen when she was concentrating, a habit she had possessed since the 2nd grade. Every time she shifted in her seat, my skin broke out in goosebumps. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to turn to her and shout, "It's me! Don't you remember me?" But as the class dragged on, a new, daring thought began to take root in my mind. If she didn't know who I was, didn't that give me a clean slate? Back when we were kids, I was just her goofy, nerdy sidekick. The one she had to protect. The one she felt sorry for. I had always harbored this massive, secret crush on her, a crush that I was far too terrified and confused to ever voice aloud. But now we were adults. We were equals. I wasn't the pitiful tomboy anymore, and she wasn't just my childhood best friend. She was an undeniably attractive girl sitting next to me in a college seminar. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe the universe had erased her memory of Ollie so that she could meet Olivia. As the lecture finally came to an end, the room erupted into the chaotic noise of students packing up their bags. Chloe nudged my shoulder. "Hey, I gotta run to my biology lab. I'll catch you at the dorm later." "Yeah, sure," I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on my desk as I slowly gathered my things. Chloe rushed out, leaving me alone in the row with Emma. Emma was struggling with a jammed zipper on her tote bag. She let out a frustrated sigh, a small sound that made my heart do a ridiculous flip. "Need a hand?" I offered, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I turned to face her fully, putting on my most charming, confident smile, the one I had perfected over the last 2 years. Emma looked up, slightly startled. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I swear I saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Question. A hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a soft, appreciative smile that made my stomach swoop. I think I've got it, but thank you, she said, giving the zipper one final forceful yank until it slid shut. She slung the bag over her shoulder and leaned against the desk, looking at me with genuine interest. I'm Emma, by the way. I know the professor announced it, but I figured I should actually introduce myself to my desk neighbor. She held out her hand. Her fingers were slender, adorned with a few silver rings. I stared at her hand for a moment. This was the crossroads. If I took her hand and told her who I really was, the illusion would shatter. We would go back to being ghosts of the past, burdened by 7 years of silence and guilt. But if I played along, if I kept my secret, I could get to know her all over again. I could make her fall for me, not as the kid next door, but as the woman I had become. Slowly, I reached out and let my hand wrap around hers. Her skin was warm, and a distinct jolt of electricity shot up my arm at the contact. Her eyes widened fractionally, letting me know she felt the spark too. I'm Olivia, I said softly, holding her gaze, refusing to break eye contact. Olivia, Emma repeated, testing the syllables on her tongue. The way she said my name sent a shiver straight down my spine. It's really nice to meet you, Olivia. Nice to meet you too, Emma, I lied smoothly, a thrilling, dangerous sense of anticipation bubbling up in my chest. She didn't know it yet, but my childhood best friend was about to become my biggest obsession. And this time, I wasn't going to let her walk out of my life without a fight. The game was officially on. End of part 1. Part 2. For the next 48 hours, I was a walking, talking disaster. I couldn't focus on my lectures, I burned my morning toast twice, and I completely ignored my roommate Chloe's extensive, color-coded plans for our weekend. My mind was entirely consumed by a pair of emerald green eyes and the lingering warmth of a handshake that felt entirely too monumental for a simple introduction. Emma was back in my life. The universe had practically dropped her right into my lap, wrapped in a vintage leather jacket and smelling of vanilla and sandalwood. By the time Wednesday morning rolled around, I was practically vibrating with nervous energy as I walked into the advanced creative writing seminar. I had spent an embarrassing amount of time picking out my outfit. I had settled on a burgundy oversized sweater that kept slipping off one shoulder, paired with dark denim and my favorite ankle boots. It was casual enough to say, I just threw this on, but carefully curated enough to make me feel incredibly confident. I took my usual seat in the third row. A few moments later, the heavy wooden doors opened, and there she was. Emma walked in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She caught my eye almost immediately. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, lighting up her features in a way that made my chest tighten painfully. She navigated the narrow aisle and dropped her canvas tote bag next to the chair beside mine. "Morning, Olivia," she said, her voice carrying that same smooth, melodic tone that I had been replaying in my head for 2 days. "Morning," I replied, forcing my heart to maintain a normal rhythm. "You look like you actually got some sleep." "I'm jealous." Emma chuckled softly, sliding into her seat and bringing her coffee cup to her lips. "Don't let the concealer fool you. I was up unpacking boxes until 3 in the morning. Moving across the country mid-semester is a nightmare I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy." "Well, you hide it well," I said, offering a playful smirk. Emma lowered her cup, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that took me completely off guard. "Thanks," she murmured, a sudden heavy beat of silence settling between us. It was the kind of silence that wasn't awkward but thick with unspoken things. The air felt suddenly charged, the background noise of the classroom fading into a dull, unimportant hum. Professor Harrison clapped his hands together at the front of the room, shattering the moment. We both snapped our attention forward, though I could still feel the phantom heat of her gaze burning into the side of my face. "All right, everyone, let's get started," Professor Harrison announced, grabbing a stack of papers from his podium. "Today, we are diving into collaborative narrative. Writing is often viewed as a solitary pursuit, but understanding how to merge your voice with another author's perspective is a vital skill. For the next month, you will be working on a joint midterm project. You and your partner will co-author a short story, alternating chapters. This will require deep communication, vulnerability, and compromise. A collective groan echoed through the lecture hall. Group projects in college were notoriously painful, usually ending with one person doing all the heavy lifting. But I didn't care about any of that. My mind immediately zeroed in on one crucial detail. "I have already paired you up," Professor Harrison continued, much to the dismay of the students who were already turning to their friends. "To make things simple, you will be working with the person sitting directly to your right." My breath hitched. Slowly, I turned my head to the right. Emma was already looking at me. One of her perfectly arched eyebrows was raised, and a slow, wicked grin was tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Well, Olivia," she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that sent a fresh wave of goosebumps down my arms. "Looks like you're stuck with me for the next month." "I think I'll survive," I whispered back, my voice remarkably steady despite the absolute chaos erupting in my stomach. "We'll see," she teased, turning back to the front. The rest of the class passed in a blur of instructions and grading rubrics, none of which I actually absorbed. My reality had narrowed down to the space between our two desks. When the lecture finally ended, Emma began packing up her notebook and pens. "So," she said, slinging her bag over her shoulder, "since we have to pour our souls into a joint story, we should probably start by figuring out if we actually hate each other's writing styles. Are you free right now?" "I have an open schedule until noon," I replied, trying not to sound too eager. "Perfect. Let's get out of here. I need a change of scenery and preferably something with an excessive amount of sugar. Lead the way, local girl." I guided us out of the academic building and across the sprawling green quad. The autumn air was biting, but the bright sunshine made the vibrant red and gold leaves glow. We walked shoulder to shoulder. Occasionally, the back of my hand would brush against hers, sending a sharp electric jolt straight to my brain. She didn't pull away. In fact, she seemed to walk just a fraction of an inch closer. We arrived at the Roasted Bean, a cozy, dimly lit campus cafe that smelled overwhelmingly of espresso and baked goods. The line was short, and when we stepped up to the counter, I didn't even have to look at the menu. "I'll have a large hot chocolate, oat milk with a dash of cinnamon and exactly 2 pumps of vanilla," I told the barista. Beside me, Emma suddenly went completely rigid. I turned to look at her, my heart dropping into my shoes. Her eyes were wide, staring at me with a look of absolute bewilderment. The playful, flirtatious energy from a moment ago had vanished, replaced by something entirely different. A ghost had just walked over her grave. "What?" I asked, my voice barely a squeak. Did I blow it? Did she figure it out? "Nothing," Emma blinked rapidly, shaking her head as if trying to physically dislodge a memory. I used to know someone who ordered that exact same ridiculously specific drink. Down to the 2 pumps of vanilla. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. "Oh," I managed a casual, dismissive shrug, praying she couldn't see the frantic pulse beating at the base of my throat. "It's a pretty standard flavor combo, I guess. Great minds think alike." Emma ordered an iced Americano, which she used to hate when we were kids, and paid for both of our drinks before I could even reach for my wallet. "My treat," she insisted. "Consider it a peace offering for whatever terrible plot ideas I pitched to you today." We grabbed our drinks and moved to a small, circular table tucked away in the back corner of the cafe. It was intimately small. Our knees bumped beneath the table as we sat down, and neither of us moved to pull away. The physical contact was a grounding wire, keeping me tethered to the present moment even as the past threatened to drag me under. Emma pulled out her laptop and opened a blank document, but she didn't look at the screen. Instead, she leaned her elbows on the table and looked directly at me. The emerald green of her eyes was mesmerizing in the warm, ambient light of the cafe. "So, Olivia," she started, wrapping her hands around her iced cup. "Tell me about yourself. If we're going to write together, I need to know what makes you tick. What's your story?" It was a simple question, but it felt like a trap. How could I tell her my story without revealing that she was the absolute center of my earliest chapters? There's not much to tell, honestly, I deflected, tracing the rim of my hot chocolate cup. I grew up in a really boring, quiet suburb. Spent most of my time reading books in trees and trying to avoid gym class. I was pretty awkward, to be honest. Emma rested her chin on her hand, a soft, indulgent smile playing on her lips. I find that very hard to believe. You don't look like you've ever had an awkward phase in your life. My cheeks flushed hot. Trust me, I did. Braces, terrible haircuts, the whole 9 yards. I only figured out how to use a hairbrush a few years ago. Well, the glow-up is working for you, she said smoothly. It was a direct, undeniable compliment. A flirtation. My childhood best friend was flirting with me. What about you? I asked quickly, desperately needing to turn the spotlight away from my precarious web of half-truths. Why the sudden transfer from California? For a fraction of a second, a shadow passed over Emma's face. The easy, confident exterior slipped, revealing something deeply vulnerable underneath. She looked down at her hands, twisting one of her silver rings. My mom passed away a few months ago, Emma said quietly, her voice losing its musical lilt. The air rushed out of my lungs. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces for the girl sitting across from me. Mrs. Davis. The woman who used to bake us peanut butter cookies and let us stay up late watching scary movies. Emma, I am so incredibly sorry, I whispered, the urge to reach out and hold her hand nearly overpowering. But I had to hold back. I had to react like a stranger hearing bad news, not a grieving friend. Thanks, she sighed, forcing a tight, fragile smile. It was sudden. After she was gone, being in California just felt empty. Everything reminded me of her. I needed a completely fresh start. A blank canvas. So I packed up my life and moved here. I figured a new city and a new school might help me breathe again. I stared at her, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of guilt and affection. She was hurting, and she had come here seeking a clean slate. My decision to hide my identity suddenly felt completely justified. If she knew I was Ollie, I would just be another link to her past. Another anchor weighing her down. She needed new beginnings, and I could give her that. I could be whoever she needed me to be. Well, I said softly, tentatively reaching across the small table. I lightly brushed my fingers over her knuckles. It was a bold move, but it felt necessary. I'm really glad you ended up here, Emma. Emma looked down at my hand touching hers, and then slowly brought her eyes back up to meet mine. The grief in her gaze shifted, melting into something intensely warm and searching. She turned her hand over, gently weaving her fingers through mine. Yeah, she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. The noisy cafe around us faded into absolute nothingness. I think I'm really glad I ended up here, too. End of Part 2. Part 3. The rest of Wednesday passed in a hazy, surreal blur. I could still feel the phantom pressure of Emma's fingers woven securely through mine long after we had thrown our empty cups away and parted ways outside the library. My hand felt branded, humming with a lingering electric warmth that absolutely refused to fade. I practically floated back to my dormitory, my mind replaying every micro-expression that had crossed her face, every shift in her emerald eyes, and the breathless, terrifying realization that my childhood best friend might actually be flirting with me. When I finally pushed open the heavy wooden door to my room, my roommate, Chloe, was sprawled upside down on her bed. Her blonde hair pooled on the floor as she aggressively scrolled through her phone. Well, look who finally decided to grace me with her presence, Chloe announced without looking up from her screen. You completely vanished after seminar. I was halfway through drafting a missing persons report. Where were you? And more importantly, why do you look like you just won the lottery and simultaneously saw a ghost? I dropped my backpack onto my desk chair with a heavy thud, suddenly feeling the sheer, overwhelming weight of the secret I was carrying. I needed to say it out loud. If I didn't tell someone, I was going to combust. I was at the roasted bean, I began, pacing the narrow strip of floor between our beds. With the new girl. Emma. Chloe flipped right side up, her eyes narrowing with sudden intense interest. She crossed her legs beneath her, sensing the drama. The gorgeous transfer student? The one in the leather jacket who looks like she stepped out of a moody indie film? Okay, go on. Did you guys hit it off? Because I saw the way you were staring at her during Mr. Harrison's lecture. You were practically drooling, Olivia. It's complicated, I groaned, running a hand through my hair. I stopped pacing and looked Chloe dead in the eyes. Chloe, you know how I told you about my childhood best friend? The one who moved to California when we were 12? The one who completely broke my heart. Yeah, Emma, Chloe nodded slowly, and then her eyes widened to the size of saucers. She gasped, a dramatic inhaled sound that echoed in the small room. Shut up. No. You are lying. I wish I was, I whispered, collapsing onto my mattress and burying my face in my hands. It's her, Chloe. It's my Emma. But she has absolutely no idea who I am. She looked right at me and she didn't recognize me at all. Okay, hold on. Time out, Chloe waved her hands frantically. How is that even possible? You guys were inseparable for years. I look completely different. I defended myself, looking up. I don't wear those thick glasses anymore, my teeth are straight, my hair is different, and nobody calls me Ollie here. To her, I'm just Olivia, a random girl in her writing seminar. And I didn't tell her the truth. Chloe stared at me in stunned silence for a full 10 seconds before a slow, wicked grin spread across her face. Wait, are you telling me that you are currently catfishing your own childhood best friend in real life? I am not catfishing her, I protested, my face burning with a mixture of shame and embarrassment. I panicked, okay? And then she told me that her mom passed away recently. She moved here because she needed a completely blank slate. A fresh start. If I tell her that I'm Ollie, I just become a painful reminder of her past. I become baggage. She needs someone new, Chloe. And I want to be that person for her. Chloe sighed, her playful demeanor softening into genuine concern. She crawled off her bed and sat next to me, bumping her shoulder against mine. Olivia, I love you and I fully support your right to pursue ridiculously attractive women, but you are playing a very dangerous game. What happens when she finds out? 'Cause she will find out eventually. You can't keep a secret like this buried forever. It's going to blow up in your face. I know, I admitted, a heavy knot of anxiety forming in the pit of my stomach. I know it's insane. But you should have seen the way she looked at me today, Chloe. It was electric. For the first time in my life, she wasn't looking at me like a pity project or a goofy sidekick. She was looking at me like she actually wanted me. I just need a little more time to build a connection with her as Olivia. Then I'll tell her. I promise. Famous last words, Chloe muttered, shaking her head. But fine. I will help you maintain this ridiculous facade. Just be careful, okay? Don't break your own heart trying to protect hers. The next 2 days were an exercise in sheer, agonizing patience. Emma and I had exchanged phone numbers at the cafe under the guise of our collaborative writing project, but neither of us had reached out. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat, only to plummet when it turned out to be a promotional email or a text from Chloe. Finally, on Friday afternoon, my screen lit up with a notification. Emma, hey partner. Ready to actually start this project? My apartment, 7 p.m. tonight. Bring your best plot twists and a massive appetite. I'm cooking. I spent the next 3 hours in a state of absolute chaotic panic. I must have tried on at least 15 different outfits. I needed to look effortless, yet devastatingly attractive. I finally settled on a pair of perfectly tailored black trousers, a soft sage green ribbed turtleneck, and delicate gold jewelry. It was understated but sophisticated. At 6:50 p.m., I was standing in front of the door to Emma's off-campus apartment. My palms were sweating so much I had to wipe them on my pants twice. I took a deep, shaky breath, raised my hand, and knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door swung open, and all the oxygen immediately vanished from my lungs. Emma was standing there in a pair of loose gray sweatpants and an oversized, faded band t-shirt that hung off one shoulder, exposing a tantalizing expanse of collarbone. Her hair was thrown up in a messy bun, a few rogue strands framing her face. She looked entirely too domestic, effortlessly beautiful, and breathtakingly casual. "Hey," she smiled, her eyes dropping down to quickly scan my outfit. I didn't miss the distinct, appreciative spark that flashed in her gaze. "You look great. Come on in." "Thanks," I managed to squeak out, stepping over the threshold. Her apartment was a chaotic mix of unpacked cardboard boxes and cozy, personalized touches. A massive, plush cream-colored sofa dominated the living room, and a string of warm fairy lights was draped haphazardly over the window frame. The air smelled heavenly, a rich blend of garlic, tomatoes, and roasting herbs. "It's a bit of a disaster zone right now," Emma apologized, kicking a box out of the way. "I'm making pasta. It's basically the only thing I know how to cook that doesn't end in a fire alarm. You can set your stuff down on the couch." "It smells amazing," I said, dropping my bag and nervously glancing around. I deliberately avoided looking too closely at the corkboard hanging near the kitchen, terrified I might spot an old, fading photograph of a 12-year-old girl with thick glasses and braces. I joined her in the small kitchen, leaning against the counter while she stirred a simmering pot of sauce. The space was tight, forcing us to stand closer than strictly necessary. I could smell the familiar, intoxicating scent of her vanilla and sandalwood perfume mixing with the aroma of the food. "So, I was thinking about our story," Emma said, keeping her eyes focused on the stove. "Professor Harrison wants deep vulnerability and collaboration. I think we should write a psychological thriller with a heavy romance subplot." "Okay, I'm intrigued," I nodded, crossing my arms to keep my hands from trembling. "What's the hook?" Emma turned off the burner and turned to face me. She leaned back against the counter, perfectly mirroring my posture. We were mere inches apart. "It's about 2 women who meet and instantly fall for each other," she began, her voice dropping an octave, becoming soft and incredibly intimate. "But one of them is harboring a massive, earth-shattering secret. She's completely lying about who she is. And the entire story is a game of cat and mouse, exploring the tension of whether true love can survive a foundation built entirely on a lie." My heart stopped completely. Cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Did she know? Was this a trap? Was she playing an incredibly cruel, elaborate game with me? I searched her face frantically, looking for a smirk, a sign of betrayal, anything. But her expression was completely earnest. She was just pitching a story idea. An idea that was horrifyingly, ironically identical to my current reality. That's a really intense concept," I stammered, swallowing hard. "You don't think it's too cliché?" "Not if we write it right," Emma murmured, taking a slow step toward me. The space between us evaporated. I was pinned between her and the kitchen counter. Her emerald eyes were dark, searching mine with a terrifying intensity. "Secrets are fascinating, Olivia. They make people unpredictable. I want to explore what happens when someone is so afraid of losing a connection, they're willing to lie to keep it." I couldn't breathe. The air in the kitchen was suddenly too thick, too hot. Her gaze flicked down to my lips for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. My pulse was a frantic, deafening drumbeat in my ears. "Can I ask you something weird?" Emma whispered, lifting her hand. Her knuckles brushed featherlight against my cheek, tucking a stray piece of hair behind my ear. Touch sent a violent, fiery shockwave straight through my chest. "Anything," I breathed, my voice barely a rasp. "I feel like I know you," she said softly, her thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw. The vulnerability in her voice broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. I know we just met. I know it's crazy. But whenever I look at you, there's this intense feeling of familiarity. Like I've been looking for you for a very long time. She was so close. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. Every logical thought, every warning Chloe had given me completely vanished from my mind. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted to crash my lips against hers and finally bridge the 7-year gap between us. I leaned in, my eyelids fluttering shut, entirely surrendering to the gravitational pull she had always had over me. Suddenly, a loud, shrill buzzing shattered the silence. Emma jumped back, her eyes wide and slightly dazed as if waking from a trance. The oven timer was going off, screaming through the apartment. "The garlic bread!" she gasped, hurriedly turning around and grabbing a pair of oven mitts. I leaned heavily against the counter, my chest heaving as I tried to pull air back into my starved lungs. My entire body was trembling. I had almost kissed her. I had almost confessed everything. We had danced right up to the edge of the cliff, and the fall was going to be absolutely devastating. End of part 3. Part 4. The blaring screech of the oven timer was like a bucket of ice water to the face. I scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a jar of wooden cooking utensils, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Emma cursed under her breath, a faint flush creeping up her neck as she ripped the oven open and pulled out a tray of perfectly golden garlic bread. The heavy, intoxicating tension that had just surrounded us dissipated into the cloud of escaping steam, but the air in the tiny kitchen still felt thick and charged. "Saved by the bell," Emma muttered, tossing the oven mitts onto the counter. She didn't look at me, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands as she transferred the bread to a plate. "Yeah," I swallowed hard, desperately trying to get my breathing under control. "Good thing. Burning the apartment down on our first project meeting would probably guarantee us a failing grade." She let out a short, breathless laugh, finally turning to meet my gaze. Her emerald eyes were still dark, still swirling with that unspoken magnetic pull. "Wine?" she asked, already reaching for a bottle of red sitting on the counter. "I feel like we're going to need it if we're going to dive into the minds of our traumatized fictional characters." "Absolutely," I agreed, incredibly thankful for the distraction. We moved to the living room, sitting cross-legged on opposite ends of her massive cream-colored sofa. We ate in a comfortable, shifting silence, the only sounds being the clinking of our forks and the soft acoustic playlist Emma had playing from a small Bluetooth speaker. Every time I took a sip of my wine, I caught her looking at me over the rim of her own glass. It wasn't the polite, casual glance of a classmate. It was a heavy, deliberate stare that made my skin tingle and my stomach tie itself into complicated, fluttering knots. Once the plates were cleared, we opened our laptops. "Okay," Emma said, pulling her knees up to her chest and resting her chin on them. "Let's talk about our liar. Protagonist who is hiding her identity. Why does she do it? If she really loves this other woman, why build a foundation on a massive lie?" Question felt like a physical blow. I stared at the blinking cursor on my blank document, my throat suddenly going dry. We weren't just writing a story anymore. We were writing my story. And I was suddenly in the terrifying position of having to defend my own deception to the person I was deceiving. "Fear," I answered quietly, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. "I think she does it out of fear. Maybe the other woman, maybe she's going through a really hard time. Maybe she explicitly stated she needed a fresh start. If the protagonist reveals who she really is, she ruins that clean slate. She becomes a ghost from the past instead of a possibility for the future." Emma tilted her head, her gaze piercing through me. "So, you think the liar is doing it out of love? To protect her?" "Yes," I nodded, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "She thinks that by hiding the truth, she's giving the woman she loves exactly what she needs. She's sacrificing her own need to be fully known in order to be a safe space." A heavy silence fell over the room. Emma took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving mine. "That's a very romantic way to look at it, Olivia." But isn't it also incredibly selfish? I flinched, the words stinging more than I anticipated. Selfish? How? Because she's taking away the other woman's agency, Emma countered, her voice dropping into a low, passionate register. She leaned forward, closing the distance on the couch between us. She's deciding what's best for her without giving her all the facts. A relationship built on an illusion is a glass house, Olivia. No matter how beautiful it is, it's going to shatter. And when the truth comes out, the betrayal won't just be about the lie itself. It will be about the fact that she was denied the choice to love the real version of the person in front of her. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart pounded a frantic, guilty rhythm against my sternum. She was right. God, she was absolutely right. I had convinced myself that keeping my identity a secret was a noble act to protect her from the grief of her past, but the truth was, I was just a coward. I was terrified that if she knew I was Ollie, the awkward, nerdy kid she left behind, she would never look at me the way she was looking at me right now. You make a really compelling argument, I managed to choke out, forcing a weak smile. I quickly looked back down at my laptop, desperate to break the intense eye contact. We should definitely incorporate that conflict. The tension between intention and betrayal. I think it's going to be brilliant, Emma smiled softly, seemingly unaware of the absolute turmoil tearing through my chest. She uncrossed her legs and stood up. I have this old notebook from high school filled with character development prompts. I think it might help us flesh out their backstories. Give me 1 second, it's in my bedroom. I let out a massive, shaky exhale as she disappeared down the short hallway. I rubbed my hands over my face, feeling the hot sting of unshed tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. This was entirely too much. The universe was playing a cruel, elaborate joke on me, forcing me to confront the reality of my actions through a fictional writing assignment. Chloe was right. This was a ticking time bomb. A few minutes later, Emma walked back into the living room, but she wasn't just carrying a notebook. She had a small, weathered wooden box tucked under her arm. She sat back down on the couch, much closer to me this time. Our knees were almost touching. She set the box on the coffee table and popped the small brass latch. I couldn't find the notebook, she admitted, her voice suddenly sounding incredibly fragile. But I found this. It's a memory box. My mom packed it for me before she died. I haven't actually opened it since I moved here. My breath hitched. I knew that box. I recognized the faded daisy sticker on the bottom left corner. We had bought those stickers at a local craft fair when we were 9 years old. I had put the matching sticker on my own secret diary back home. Emma reached into the box and pulled out a stack of Polaroids and folded letters. Her fingers brushed over the top photograph, and a bittersweet, melancholic smile graced her lips. We were talking about the past earlier, she said softly, her eyes locked on the photo. About ghosts. I have a ghost of my own, actually. Oh, I whispered, my vocal cords feeling like they were made of sandpaper. My hands gripped the fabric of my trousers in a death grip. Yeah, Emma nodded, tracing the edge of the Polaroid with her thumb. My childhood best friend. We were completely inseparable. We lived next door to each other, passed notes through our windows, we even had a secret knock. She chuckled, a sad, hollow sound that shattered my heart. I called her Ollie. She was this brilliant, quiet kid with the biggest glasses and the wildest imagination. When my parents got divorced and my mom moved us to California, leaving her behind was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I was completely paralyzed. Hearing her talk about me, the old me, with such profound tenderness and regret was agonizing. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to scream, I'm right here. I'm your Ollie. Why didn't you stay in touch? I asked, hating how much my voice trembled. I tried, Emma sighed, leaning back against the couch cushions, closing her eyes. For the first year, we wrote letters constantly. But things in California were really bad. My mom was severely depressed, money was tight, and I was drowning in this new, terrifying environment. Eventually, the letters became too painful. Every time I wrote to Ollie, it reminded me of the home I lost. So I stopped writing. It was the most selfish thing I've ever done. I abandoned her because it was easier than facing my own grief. A single tear slipped down Emma's cheek, catching the warm light of the fairy lamps. Without thinking, pure instinct took over. I reached out and gently cupped her face, my thumb catching the tear before it could fall into her lap. Emma's breath hitched, her emerald eyes snapping open to meet mine. The sorrow in her gaze immediately melted into a startling, overwhelming heat. She leaned into my palm, turning her face just slightly so her lips brushed against my wrist. Touch sent a violent jolt of electricity straight to my core. "You were just a kid, Emma," I whispered fiercely, my heart pouring into every single syllable. "You were surviving. I'm sure. I'm sure she would understand. I'm sure she already forgave you." Emma looked at me, a desperate, searching expression on her beautiful face. She brought her own hand up, wrapping her fingers gently around my wrist to hold my hand against her cheek. But as she did, her thumb dragged across the inside of my wrist. She froze. Her entire body went rigid. The air in the room suddenly evaporated. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Emma lowered my hand, pulling it away from her face but keeping her grip entirely firm on my wrist. She turned my arm, exposing the pale skin on the inside of my forearm to the light. Right there, resting just above my pulse point, was a small, distinct crescent moon-shaped scar. I had gotten it when we were 10 years old. Emma and I were climbing the old oak tree in my backyard, and I had slipped. She had tried to catch me, but I ended up scraping my wrist against a sharp, broken branch on the way down. She had cried harder than I did, wrapping my arm in a band-aid she colored with a purple marker. Emma stared at the scar. The silence in the apartment was deafening, pressing in on my eardrums like a physical weight. Her emerald eyes flicked from the scar on my wrist up to my eyes and then back down to the scar. I watched, completely helpless, as the gears turned in her head. I watched the confusion morph into realization, and the realization violently crash into absolute, undeniable shock. "Olivia," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat, breathless, and terrifyingly cold. She dropped my wrist as if my skin had suddenly caught fire. She looked at me, truly looked at me, searching past the contacts, the clothes, and the confident facade, hunting for the ghost of the girl she left behind. "Where did you get that scar?" End of Part 4. Part 5. The silence in the living room was no longer just heavy, it was suffocating. Pressed against my windpipe, choking the air out of my lungs. I sat frozen on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, staring at Emma's hand hovering inches away from my arm. The warm, inviting ambient light of the fairy lamp suddenly felt harsh and unforgiving, exposing the absolute worst parts of me. "Where did you get that scar?" Emma repeated. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet of the apartment like a sharpened blade. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was completely parched. My mind raced frantically, trying to formulate a lie, a bike accident, a cooking mishap, anything. But looking into her emerald eyes, which were currently swirling with a terrifying mix of confusion and dawning horror, I knew the game was over. The house of cards I had so carefully built was collapsing right on top of me. "Emma, I started, my voice trembling so violently I barely recognized it as my own. She didn't wait for me to finish. She was already piecing it together. I could physically see the memories clicking into place behind her eyes. The overly specific hot chocolate order at the cafe. The way I knew she hated iced Americanos as a kid. The subtle, familiar mannerisms I hadn't been able to entirely erase. And now the crescent moon scar. The exact same scar she had bandaged with a purple marker 9 years ago. She took a massive, stumbling step backward, putting as much physical distance between us as the small space allowed. The warmth that had been radiating between us just moments ago vanished, replaced by an icy, bone-chilling draft. "Oh my God," Emma breathed out, the syllables cracking in half. She pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening as she stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. "It's you. You're Ollie." Hearing her say that name, my old name, the name she hadn't spoken to my face in 7 years, shattered the last remaining barrier inside my chest. Tears instantly flooded my vision, hot and blinding. "Yes," I sobbed, the word tearing out of my throat. "Emma, please. Let me explain." "Explain," Emma interrupted, dropping her hand from her mouth. Her shock was rapidly mutating into something far more dangerous, pure, unadulterated anger. Her emerald eyes blazed with a fierce, burning betrayal that made me shrink back into the cushions. "Explain how you sat next to me all week and pretended to be a complete stranger? Explain how you held my hand, drank coffee with me, and listened to me pour my heart out about my dead mother, all while secretly knowing exactly who I was." "I didn't plan it," I cried out, desperately reaching a hand out toward her. She flinched away from my movement, which hurt worse than a physical blow. "When you walked into that lecture hall, I was just as shocked as you were. I was paralyzed. I waited for you to recognize me, Emma. I looked right at you and you didn't see me. You just saw Olivia." "So your solution was to lie to my face?" she demanded, her voice rising in volume. She began pacing the small space between the coffee table and the television stand, her hands violently running through her messy bun, pulling at the strands of hair. "You let me sit here 5 minutes ago and confess how much guilt I carried over abandoning you. You watched me cry over a Polaroid of you, Olivia. Do you have any idea how twisted that is? How deeply messed up that is? I was trying to protect you," I yelled back, standing up from the sofa. Tears were flowing freely now, hot tracks burning down my cheeks. "You told me you moved here for a clean slate. You said everything in California reminded you of your grief. If I told you I was Ollie, I wouldn't be a fresh start. I'd be a walking, talking reminder of the past that you ran away from. I wanted to give you the safe space you were looking for." Emma stopped pacing. She turned to face me, and the expression on her face completely broke me. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was devastation. "You didn't do this to protect me," Emma said, her voice dropping into a low, lethal whisper. "You did this to protect yourself." I froze, the air leaving my lungs. "You used my grief as an excuse," she continued, taking a slow step toward me, quoting the exact words from our writing discussion earlier. "You took away my agency. You decided what was best for me without giving me the truth. You built this entirely on an illusion, just like we talked about for the project. Did you think this was a game? Did you think you could just seduce your way back into my life without ever having to face the messy reality of what happened between us? No. I swear, Emma, I don't want to hear it," she cut me off, holding up a hand. Her hand was shaking. "I feel incredibly stupid. I thought there was a real connection happening here. I thought I had met someone amazing. But it was just a performance." "It wasn't a performance," I pleaded, taking a desperate step forward. "My feelings for you aren't a lie, Emma. They never have been. Not when we were 12 and not now." Emma squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away as if the sight of me was physically painful. When she opened them again, the emotional walls were fully built, towering high and impenetrable between us. The vulnerable, affectionate girl who had almost kissed me in the kitchen was gone, locked entirely away. "I think you need to leave," Emma said, her voice flat and utterly devoid of emotion. "Emma, please don't do this. Let's just talk about it." "Get out, Olivia," she snapped, pointing a trembling finger toward the front door. "Take your things and get out of my apartment. Right now." The finality in her tone left absolutely zero room for argument. A heavy, suffocating blanket of despair settled over my shoulders. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely gather my laptop and my canvas bag. I wanted to fight for her, I wanted to stay and force her to see my side, but I had already violated her trust enough for one night. Pushing her boundaries now would only make it worse. I walked toward the door, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, looking back over my shoulder one last time. Emma had her back turned to me. She was leaning over the kitchen counter, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her head was bowed, and her shoulders were shaking with silent, suppressed sobs. Leaving her like that was the hardest thing I had ever done. Felt like I was 12 years old all over again, watching the moving truck pull out of her driveway, helpless to stop her from disappearing from my life. I pulled the door open and stepped out into the freezing autumn night. The chill hit me instantly, biting through my thin sage-green sweater, but it was nothing compared to the absolute ice currently freezing my veins. I practically ran all the way back to the campus dormitories, the streetlights blurring into yellow streaks through my tears. When I burst into my room, Chloe was sitting at her desk, typing furiously on her laptop. She took one look at my tear-stained, blotchy face and immediately slammed her computer shut. "Oh, honey," Chloe sighed, rushing over and pulling me into a fierce, tight hug. I completely broke down, collapsing against her shoulder. We slid down onto the floor together, leaning against the edge of my bed. I cried until my chest physically ached, gasping for air between messy, broken sentences as I recounted everything that had happened. The scar, the realization, the horrible, undeniable look of betrayal in her eyes. "She hates me, Chloe," I sobbed, burying my face in my hands. I completely ruined it. I had her back, and I ruined it because I was too much of a coward to just tell her the truth. Chloe rubbed my back in slow, soothing circles. "I'm not going to sit here and say I told you so, even though I absolutely did. What you did was stupid, Olivia. Really incredibly stupid. But you didn't do it maliciously. You panicked. And she's hurt right now, which she has every right to be. But she's also grieving, and she just had her entire reality tilted on its axis." "She told me to get out," I whispered, staring blankly at the beige carpet of our dorm room. "She couldn't even look at me." "So, give her space," Chloe advised gently. "Let her cool off. Let her process the fact that the ghost she's been carrying around is actually sitting right next to her in class. You can't force her to forgive you overnight." "But what about Monday?" I asked, a fresh wave of anxiety rolling over me. "We're partners for the midterm project. We have to co-author an entire story together for the next month. How am I supposed to sit next to her and write a romantic thriller when she won't even speak to me?" "You're just going to have to face the music," Chloe said, handing me a box of tissues. "You made this bed, Ollie. Now you have to lie in it. You show up, you do the work, and you prove to her that you aren't just a liar. You show her who you really are." The weekend dragged by in agonizing, painful slow motion. I checked my phone obsessively, hoping for a text, a call, an angry paragraph, anything. But my screen remained completely dark. Emma had ghosted me, retreating back behind the fortress walls she had built around herself. By the time Monday morning arrived, I was running on exactly 3 hours of sleep and entirely too much caffeine. I walked into the advanced creative writing seminar feeling like I was marching to my own execution. I took my usual seat in the third row, placing my notebook precisely in the center of my desk. The lecture hall filled up quickly, the chaotic chatter of college students echoing off the high ceilings. I kept my eyes glued to the heavy wooden doors at the front. At exactly 9 a.m., Emma walked in. My breath caught in my throat. She was wearing her vintage leather jacket again, but her hair was pulled back into a tight, severe ponytail. She looked exhausted, with faint, dark circles bruising the skin beneath her emerald eyes. She didn't look up as she walked down the aisle. She didn't smile. She reached our row and dropped her canvas tote bag onto the chair next to mine. Instead of sitting down, she pulled out her laptop, opened it, and placed it aggressively on the line dividing our two desks, effectively creating a physical wall between us. Then she sat down, keeping her body angled entirely toward Professor Harrison. "Emma," I whispered, leaning slightly toward the barricade. "Please, can we just—" "Don't," she hissed, cutting me off without even turning her head. Her voice was pure ice. "We are here to do a project. We will communicate exclusively through the Google document. You write a chapter, I write a chapter. I don't want to hear your voice, and I don't want to hear your apologies. Are we clear?" I swallowed the massive lump forming in my throat, the sting of her rejection burning my eyes all over again. The game was entirely different now. It wasn't about hiding my identity anymore. It was a war of words, and she had just drawn the battle lines. "Crystal clear," I whispered back, opening my own laptop. Professor Harrison began his lecture, but I wasn't listening. I opened our shared document. Emma's cursor was already blinking aggressively at the top of the page. Under the title, she had typed a single bolded sentence. Chapter 1, The Anatomy of a Liar. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a fierce, desperate rhythm. She was angry. She was deeply, profoundly hurt. But as I watched her type out the first agonizing paragraph of our story, weaving all her betrayal and fury into the fictional narrative, I realized something. She wasn't running away this time. She was staying to fight. And I was absolutely going to fight back. End of Part 5. Part 6. The Google Doc became our battlefield, and the blinking cursor was our weapon of choice. For the entire 90 minutes of Mr. Harrison's seminar, the physical space between Emma and me was an absolute frozen wasteland. The laptop she had positioned like a barricade dividing our desks remained untouched by either of us. She didn't glance in my direction. She didn't sigh, shift her weight, or give any indication that I even existed in the same three-dimensional plane. But inside the digital margins of our shared document, she was screaming at me. I sat with my hands trembling over my keyboard, watching in real time as Emma's green cursor flew across the screen, carving out the first chapter of our midterm project. The story was supposed to be a romantic thriller about a woman harboring a secret identity, but Emma wasn't writing fiction. She was writing a thinly veiled, devastatingly accurate autopsy of my betrayal. I read the words as they materialized on the screen, each sentence hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. The liar wore confidence like a tailored suit, hiding the ragged, desperate edges of who she really was, Emma typed, her keystrokes aggressive and sharp, echoing loudly in the quiet lecture hall. She built a house of glass, inviting the protagonist inside, offering warmth and shelter. But she knew all along that the foundation was made of ash. The tragedy wasn't just the lie itself, it was the sheer arrogance of assuming she had the right to play God with someone else's reality. I swallowed a thick, agonizing knot in my throat, blinking rapidly to keep the tears from spilling over onto my keyboard. It was brutal. It was raw. It was exactly what I deserved. When class finally ended, Emma slammed her laptop shut. Without a single word or a backward glance, she shoved it into her canvas tote bag, stood up, and practically bolted out of the lecture hall. I was left sitting alone in the third row, staring blankly at the empty chair beside me, the phantom scent of vanilla and sandalwood lingering cruelly in the air. I spent the rest of the day in a state of absolute hollow numbness. I skipped my afternoon biology lab and retreated straight to my dorm room, crawling into bed and pulling the covers up to my chin. Chloe tried to coax me out with pizza and a movie, but I couldn't stomach the thought of eating. My entire existence was reduced to the blinking blue cursor on my laptop screen, waiting for my turn to speak in a language Emma could not silence. By nightfall, the glow of the screen was the only light in the dark room. Emma had finished her chapter. Now it was my turn. Chapter 2, The Anatomy of a Ghost. I rested my fingers on the keys, took a deep, shaky breath, and began to bleed onto the page. If she wanted to use this project to put me on trial, I was going to use it to submit my defense. I wasn't going to justify the lie, but I was going to make her understand the absolute suffocating terror that had caused it. She didn't build the glass house out of arrogance, I typed, the words pouring out of me in a frantic, desperate rush. She built it out of sheer, paralyzing fear. The liar had spent a lifetime standing outside in the cold, watching the one person she loved through a window, separated by years of silence and an ocean of distance. When the door finally opened, she panicked. She knew her true face was tied to a past filled with grief and abandonment. She believed, with every broken piece of her heart, that if she stepped into the light as herself, the door would slam shut forever. I wrote for hours. I poured every ounce of my unspoken love, my deep-seated insecurities, and my agonizing regret into the fictional perspective of the liar. I wrote about the pain of being forgotten. I wrote about the electric, terrifying thrill of being seen as an equal rather than just a pity project. I wrote until my fingers cramped and my vision blurred. When I finally hit save and closed the laptop, it was almost 3 a.m. I collapsed back against my pillows, feeling entirely emotionally drained but incredibly lighter. The ball was back in her court. The rest of the week settled into a grueling, silent routine. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Emma and I sat next to each other in the seminar, separated by the physical barrier of her laptop. She looked exhausted, her emerald eyes guarded and cold. We didn't exchange a single spoken word. But the Google Doc was a completely different story. The document exploded. It morphed from a simple academic assignment into a chaotic, intensely intimate digital diary. We were writing chapters at a furious pace, alternating perspectives, tearing each other apart and desperately trying to stitch the pieces back together. In Chapter 3, Emma's protagonist expressed the profound, earth-shattering grief of losing her childhood best friend all over again. It was a double homicide of the heart, Emma wrote, the green cursor moving slower, almost hesitantly. She didn't just lose the confident stranger she was falling for. She lost the innocent memory of the girl she left behind. The liar had corrupted both. In Chapter 4, my character fought back, dropping the defensive walls entirely. She didn't corrupt the memory, she preserved it. She carried it for 7 years. The liar's biggest crime wasn't deception. It was loving someone so entirely that she was willing to erase herself just to exist in their orbit. It was psychological warfare, but beneath the anger and the accusations, a fragile, undeniable shift was beginning to occur. The writing was becoming less venomous and far more vulnerable. The physical proximity in class became increasingly difficult to bear. Every time Emma shifted in her seat, every time her knee accidentally brushed against mine, the air crackled with heavy, unresolved tension. I caught her glancing at me out of the corner of her eye a few times, her expression unreadable, before she quickly snapped her attention back to the professor. It all came to a head late Thursday night. A heavy, torrential rainstorm was battering the windows of my dorm room. Chloe was sound asleep, her soft snores providing a steady background rhythm to the chaos in my head. It was 2:47 a.m. I was sitting cross-legged on my bed in the dark, the bright glow of my laptop illuminating my face. I was stuck on Chapter 6. I was trying to describe the exact moment my character realized she was in love with the protagonist, but the words felt hollow. I stared at the blinking blue cursor, entirely frustrated, my mind drifting back to the way Emma's hand had felt wrapped around my wrist right before everything fell apart. Suddenly, a small, circular icon popped up in the top right corner of the screen. An anonymous green iguana. Emma was online. My breath caught in my throat. I completely froze, my hands hovering above the keyboard. I watched, heart pounding violently against my ribs, as her green cursor materialized at the bottom of the page, right below where I was currently typing. We were both awake. We were both in the document. For 2 full minutes, neither of us moved. The blue cursor and the green cursor just blinked on the screen, a digital representation of 2 people standing in the dark, staring at each other across an impossible divide. The silence in my room felt deafening. Then Emma's cursor moved. She scrolled up the page, highlighting a sentence I had written an hour earlier. It was a line about the liar's internal monologue. She lied because she was terrified that the truth wasn't enough to make her stay. A small comment box popped up on the right side of the screen. I held my breath as I watched Emma type into it, letter by agonizing letter. Emma Davis, 2:51 a.m. Was it really just fear? Or was it just easier for you to play a flawless, confident character than to actually be vulnerable with me? My heart plummeted into my stomach. It was the very first time she had directly addressed me outside the narrative since she kicked me out of her apartment. She wasn't hiding behind the protagonist anymore. She was asking Ollie. My fingers trembled as I clicked on the reply button. Olivia, 2:52 a.m. It wasn't a character, Emma. Everything I felt, everything I said to you, that was real. I am confident now. I am different. But underneath all of that, I was still just the same girl who was terrified you would leave me behind again. The green cursor stopped blinking. I waited in absolute agony, counting the seconds as they ticked by. The rain lashed furiously against the windowpane. I could almost picture her sitting in her apartment, illuminated by the fairy lights, staring at the screen with those piercing emerald eyes. Emma Davis, 2:55 a.m. You didn't give me the chance to stay. You took that choice away from me. Olivia, 2:56 a.m. I know. And I will never forgive myself for that. I am so incredibly sorry. I just wanted a chance to know you without the ghost of our past standing between us. Emma Davis, 2:58 a.m. The ghost is always going to be there, Ollie. We can't just pretend she doesn't exist. She called me Ollie. The name hit the screen like a physical jolt of electricity. A choked sob escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet dorm room. It was the first time she had typed my old name. It wasn't an accusation this time, it was an acknowledgement. A bridge extending tentatively over the chasm I had created. I quickly wiped the tears from my eyes, my fingers flying over the keys. Olivia, 2:59 a.m. I know. I'm not trying to hide her anymore. I promise. There was a long, agonizing pause. I watched the green cursor hover near the comment box, blinking steadily. I waited for her to log off. I waited for her to delete the comments and rebuild the wall. Instead, a new comment appeared. Emma Davis, 3:02 a.m. Meet me at the campus library. The third floor archives. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. Before I could even process the words, the green iguana icon vanished from the top corner of the screen. Emma had disconnected. I sat there in the dark, staring at the glowing text until my eyes burned. The battle in the Google Doc was officially over. Tomorrow night, we were taking this offline. And for the first time in a week, a tiny, fragile spark of hope ignited in the center of my chest. End of Part 6. Part 7. The next 17 hours were an absolute, agonizing masterclass in torture. Time seemed to warp and stretch, every single minute dripping by like thick molasses. I couldn't focus in any of my Friday classes, my leg constantly bouncing under the desk as my eyes darted to the clock on the wall every few seconds. I skipped lunch entirely, my stomach tied into such intricate, nervous knots that the mere thought of food made me nauseous. The digital exchange in the Google Doc played on an endless, looping reel in my mind. Meet me at the campus library. The third floor archives. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. It was a lifeline. A very fragile, incredibly thin lifeline, but I was going to grip it with both hands and hold on for dear life. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, I was standing in front of my dorm room mirror, completely paralyzed by indecision. For the past 2 years, I had carefully curated my Olivia aesthetic, effortlessly chic, perfectly put together, armed to the teeth with confidence. But tonight that felt like armor. And Emma had made it abundantly clear in our shared document that she didn't want the confident stranger anymore. She wanted the truth. I stripped off the tailored trousers and the elegant blouse I had initially put on. Instead, I dug into the very back of my closet and pulled out a pair of worn-in, comfortable jeans and an oversized, faded graphic tee that belonged to a band Emma and I used to obsess over when we were 11. I threw a thick, chunky knit cardigan over it and completely bypassed my makeup bag. I tied my hair back into a simple, messy claw clip. When I turned back to the mirror, I didn't look like the flawless college girl who had walked into the seminar on Monday. I looked a little vulnerable, a little raw, and undeniably like an older version of the girl who used to pass notes through a bedroom window. I looked like Ollie. You look perfect, Chloe said softly from her bed, watching me with a sympathetic smile. You look like yourself. Just breathe, okay? Go get your girl back. Thanks, Chloe, I whispered, offering her a shaky, terrified smile before grabbing my keys and stepping out into the brisk autumn night. The walk to the campus library felt like a march to the gallows. Campus was relatively quiet, most students already pre-gaming for weekend parties or huddled in their dorms. The library itself was an imposing Gothic-style building made of dark stone and ivy. It always felt a little intimidating, but tonight it looked downright terrifying. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the warm, dry air washing over my freezing skin. The familiar scent of old paper, binding glue, and floor wax filled my lungs. I bypassed the main study halls, which were sparsely populated, and headed straight for the grand, sweeping staircase in the back. The third-floor archives were notorious on campus for being an absolute ghost town. It was where the university stored decades-old academic journals, historical texts, and forgotten records. There were no comfortable lounge chairs or charging ports, just endless rows of towering metal bookshelves and flickering fluorescent lights. When I reached the top of the stairs, the silence was deafening. The air up here was cooler, heavy with the weight of untouched history. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I began to walk down the central aisle, my sneakers squeaking faintly on the linoleum floor. Emma! I called out softly, my voice trembling slightly in the vast, empty space. I'm back here, a voice replied. The sound of her actual spoken voice, not a text, not a Google Doc comment, sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. I turned down the fourth aisle, the narrow space flanked by towering walls of dusty encyclopedias. Emma was sitting cross-legged on the floor at the very end of the aisle. She was wearing her signature leather jacket, her knees pulled up to her chest, resting her chin on her arms. A single small desk lamp plugged into a nearby wall outlet cast a warm, intimate pool of light around her, throwing long, dramatic shadows against the bookshelves. I stopped a few feet away from her, my breath catching in my throat. She looked up, her emerald eyes locking onto mine, and the absolute intensity of her gaze pinned me securely to the floor. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other. I watched her eyes track over my face, completely devoid of makeup, down to the oversized band tee, and finally to the way I was nervously twisting my fingers together, a habit I had desperately tried to break, but one that Ollie used to do whenever she was anxious. I saw the exact moment the defensive walls she had built up all week began to crack. A soft, barely perceptible shudder ran through her shoulders. "You're wearing the Arctic Monkeys shirt," Emma said, her voice a fragile, hushed whisper that echoed in the quiet aisle. "I found it in a thrift store last year." I swallowed hard, taking a tiny, hesitant step forward. It reminded me of the time we tried to learn all the lyrics to Fluorescent Adolescent, and you lost your voice for 3 days. A tiny ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of Emma's mouth before she quickly suppressed it. She looked down at the floor, tracing the pattern of the linoleum with her finger. "Why are we here, Emma?" I asked softly, the vulnerability in my voice bleeding into the quiet space. "Why the archives?" "Because," Emma started, taking a deep, shaky breath as she raised her head to look at me again. "This is where the university keeps all of its old, forgotten history. The things that are dead and buried. I needed to figure out if that's what we are, Olivia. I needed to see if our story belongs in a dusty box on a shelf or if there's actually a reason to keep reading." The raw honesty in her words brought a fresh wave of tears to my eyes. I didn't try to stop them this time. I let them fall, letting her see exactly how much this was breaking me. "I don't want to be a forgotten history," I choked out, my voice cracking entirely. "I made a terrible mistake. I was a coward. I was so terrified of being the awkward kid you left behind that I tried to be someone untouchable. But the truth is, I have never stopped looking for you, Emma. Every time I drank hot chocolate, every time I smelled vanilla, every time autumn came around, you were there. You have always been there." Emma closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking a shiny path down her cheek. She uncrossed her legs and slowly stood up. The space between us was incredibly narrow, the towering bookshelves pressing in on both sides, creating a cocoon of intense, suffocating intimacy. She took a step toward me, then another, until she was standing so close I could feel the heat radiating from her body. The scent of her perfume wrapped around me, completely intoxicating and painfully familiar. "You really hurt me," Emma whispered, looking up at me. The anger was gone, leaving behind a devastating, bruised vulnerability. When I saw that scar, it felt like the floor collapsed beneath me. I didn't just feel lied to, Ollie. I felt like I was losing my mind. I thought I had found someone new to help me heal from losing my mom, and in the same breath, I realized I was sitting next to the ghost of my biggest regret. "I know," I breathed, desperately wanting to reach out, but forcing my hands to stay firmly at my sides. "I know, and I am so incredibly sorry. I never ever wanted to use your grief against you. I just wanted to be a safe place for you to land." Emma stared into my eyes, searching past the apologies, digging straight down into my soul. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently reached out. I held my breath as her fingertips grazed the inside of my left wrist. She didn't push up my sleeve. She didn't need to. She just let her thumb rest over the fabric, pressing lightly against the exact spot where the crescent moon scar resided. The phantom touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to my heart, a searing heat that completely melted the ice that had been freezing my veins for the past 5 days. "I was so angry," Emma confessed, her voice dropping into a low, raspy register as she stepped even closer. Our chests were almost brushing. "I was furious that you took my choice away. But then I started reading your chapters in the Google document." My breath hitched. "You did." "I read every single word," she nodded, her eyes darkening, the emerald color swirling with an intense magnetic heat. "And the more you wrote, the more I realized something terrifying." "What?" I whispered, entirely captivated by her gaze. "I realized that I wasn't just grieving the lie," Emma said, her thumb slowly dragging up from my wrist, tracing a line of fire up my arm, over my shoulder, and coming to rest softly against the side of my neck. Her skin was warm, her pulse beating rapidly against my collarbone. I was grieving the fact that I actually wanted the lie to be true. 'Cause I was falling for Olivia. Hard. And finding out that Olivia was actually Ollie, it meant that I was falling for the one person in the world who holds the power to completely destroy me. Confession hung in the dusty air, heavy and absolute. She was falling for me. The girl who had held my heart since I was 4 years old was falling in love with me. "I would never destroy you," I vowed fiercely, leaning my face into the warmth of her palm. My own hands finally came up, tentatively resting on her waist, gripping the soft leather of her jacket. "I would burn the whole world down before I ever let anything hurt you again, Emma. I swear to you." Emma let out a shaky, exhaled breath that sounded like a sob. She closed the final fraction of an inch between us, burying her face into the crook of my neck. Her arms wrapped tightly around my shoulders, holding on to me with a desperate, crushing grip. I instantly wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her flush against my body. I buried my face in her chestnut hair, breathing in the scent of vanilla and sandalwood like it was the only oxygen left in the room. We stood there in the dimly lit aisle of the archives, surrounded by decades of forgotten history, holding on to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. The week of silence, the anger, the bitter words in the document, it all dissolved into the absolute undeniable relief of being back in her arms. "I missed you," Emma whispered into my skin, her voice muffled and wet with tears. "God, Ollie, I missed you so much." "I'm right here," I promised, tightening my grip, refusing to ever let her go again. "I'm not going anywhere. We aren't history, Emma. We're just getting started." End of Part 7. Part 8. We stood there in the dimly lit aisle of the university archives, wrapped in each other's arms, letting 7 years of absence, silence, and misunderstanding quietly bleed out onto the dusty linoleum floor. The frantic, terrified rhythm of my heart finally began to slow, matching the steady, grounding thud of Emma's pulse against my chest. Slowly, reluctantly, Emma pulled back just enough to look at me. Her hands remained securely anchored around my neck, her fingers tangling slightly in the loose hair at the nape of my neck. Her emerald eyes were bright with unshed tears, but the cold, defensive walls that had been up all week were entirely demolished. She was looking at me with a terrifyingly beautiful mixture of profound relief and raw, undeniable hunger. "I've spent the last 5 days trying to convince myself that I hated you," Emma whispered, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fleeting second before snapping back up to my eyes. "I wrote thousands of words trying to make you the villain of my story." "And did it work?" I breathed, my hands tracing the curve of her waist, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer until there was absolutely zero space left between us. "No," she shook her head, a soft, breathless laugh escaping her lips. "It just made me realize how hopelessly entangled I am with you. Ollie, Olivia, whoever you want to be. I just want you." The air in the narrow aisle suddenly grew impossibly thick. Quiet hum of the library's ventilation system faded into absolute nothingness. Every single nerve ending in my body was vibrating with electric anticipation. I had dreamed about this exact moment since I was 12 years old, staring out my bedroom window at the house next door. But the fantasy paled in comparison to the reality of her standing right in front of me, her breath warm against my cheek, her eyes giving me complete, unspoken permission. I brought my hand up, gently cupping the side of her face. My thumb brushed over her cheekbone, wiping away a stray tear. Emma leaned into my touch, her eyelids fluttering shut, a soft sigh escaping her parted lips. "Can I?" I whispered, needing to hear it, needing to be absolutely sure that we were finally crossing this line. Emma opened her eyes, the emerald green blazing with a fierce, decisive heat. "If you don't kiss me right now, Olivia, I am going to lose my mind." I didn't hesitate for another second. I leaned in and pressed my lips to hers. The impact was earth-shattering. It wasn't a hesitant, cautious first kiss. It was an absolute collision. 7 years of repressed longing, guilt, fear, and overwhelming affection ignited all at once. Emma let out a soft, muted gasp against my mouth, her hands gripping my shoulders tightly as she pulled me closer, as if she was terrified I might suddenly evaporate into thin air. Her lips were impossibly soft, tasting faintly of cherry lip balm and the lingering salt of her tears. Kiss deepened, shifting from a desperate search for reassurance into something fiercely passionate and entirely consuming. My hands roamed over her vintage leather jacket, pulling her flush against my body, feeling the frantic, hammering beat of her heart mirroring my own. Felt like coming home and discovering a brand new world all at once. She was kissing Ollie, the girl who knew all her deepest childhood secrets, and she was kissing Olivia, the woman who had captivated her in a college lecture hall. 2 halves of my identity finally fused together, cemented by the overwhelming heat of her mouth. When we finally broke apart, entirely starved for oxygen, we rested our foreheads together. We were both panting softly, our chests rising and falling in perfect unison. Emma's eyes were dark, dilated, and shining with a brilliant, euphoric light. "Wow," she breathed, a stunning, genuine smile breaking across her face. It was the first time I had seen her truly smile all week, and it completely stopped my heart. "Yeah," I laughed, a dizzying wave of pure joy washing over me. "Wow." We left the library a few minutes later, our fingers tightly intertwined. The heavy rainstorm from the previous night had completely passed, leaving the campus air crisp, cold, and smelling of damp earth and pine needles. The walk back to her apartment felt entirely different from the last time I had made this trek. Crushing anxiety was gone, replaced by a buoyant, bubbling sense of absolute invincibility. When we reached her door, she unlocked it and pulled me inside. The apartment was exactly as I remembered it. The warm fairy lights, the unpacked cardboard boxes, the massive cream-colored sofa. But it no longer felt like a crime scene. Felt like a sanctuary. Emma shrugged off her leather jacket and tossed it onto a nearby chair, kicking off her combat boots. "Do you want some tea?" Or, I think I have half a bottle of that red wine left from last week, if it hasn't turned into vinegar. Tea is perfect, I said, toeing off my own sneakers and sinking into the plush cushions of the sofa. She disappeared into the tiny kitchen, the soft clinking of mugs and the gentle hum of the electric kettle filling the space. I watched her from the living room, completely mesmerized by the simple, domestic grace of her movements. I was sitting in her living room in my oversized faded band t-shirt, completely unmasked, and she had kissed me. She actually wanted me. A few minutes later, she returned carrying 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea. She didn't sit on the opposite end of the couch this time. She sat right next to me, tucking her legs beneath her and leaning her entire body weight against my side. I immediately wrapped my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, resting my chin on the top of her head. "So," Emma murmured, taking a sip of her tea and staring at the blank television screen across the room. "We have a bit of a problem." "A problem?" I asked, my heart giving a slight, involuntary jump. "Yeah," she nodded, tilting her head up to look at me, a playful, wicked glint in her eyes. "Our midterm project. The Google Doc is currently a war zone of passive-aggressive literary metaphors and unresolved psychological trauma. We have 3 days before the final submission, and currently our protagonists absolutely hate each other." I let out a loud, relieved laugh, the tension instantly bleeding out of my shoulders. Right. The romantic thriller that rapidly devolved into a tragedy. "Professor Harrison said we needed deep vulnerability and collaboration," Emma noted, placing her mug on the coffee table and reaching for her laptop, which was sitting on the floor beside the couch. She pulled it onto her lap and opened the screen. The bright white light of the document illuminated her face in the dim room. "I think we gave him plenty of vulnerability. But we need a resolution. We need an ending." She logged into the shared document. I leaned over her shoulder, watching the screen. There were pages and pages of our chaotic, emotional sparring. It was a digital graveyard of our fears and insecurities. "Where do we even start?" I asked, resting my cheek against her temple. "We start by burning down the glass house," Emma said softly. Her green cursor blinked at the bottom of the document, right below the last agonizing paragraph I had written 2 nights ago. She rested her fingers on the keys and began to type. The liar expected the door to remain locked. She expected the silence to stretch into eternity, cementing her fate as a ghost. But the protagonist didn't walk away. She realized that the foundation of ash wasn't a trap. It was the remains of a fire they had both survived. Emma paused, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She turned her head slightly, her lips brushing against my jawline. "Your turn." Tell me what she does next. I reached my arms around her, resting my hands over hers on the keyboard. Together, our fingers moved across the keys, merging our thoughts in real time. The protagonist reached through the shattered remnants of the glass house and took the liar's hand. I typed, feeling the steady rhythm of Emma's breathing against my chest. She didn't demand perfection. She didn't ask for the confident stranger anymore. She just asked for the truth. And in the ruins of their shared deception, they finally began to build something real. Something made of stone. We sat there for hours, completely enveloped in each other, rewriting the ending of our fictional counterparts. We stripped away the thriller elements and turned it into a deeply intimate character study of forgiveness and second chances. We laughed at some of our overly dramatic dialogue from earlier chapters, and we quietly deleted the paragraphs that felt too harsh, too cruel to keep on the page. By the time we typed the end at the bottom of the document, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft, bruised purple glow through the apartment windows. Emma closed the laptop and set it aside. She looked completely exhausted, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her smile was incredibly bright and content. She shifted on the couch, lying down and resting her head directly in my lap. I began to gently run my fingers through her wavy chestnut hair, massaging her scalp. She let out a soft, contented sigh, her eyes fluttering shut. "I'm really glad you wore that Arctic Monkeys shirt," Emma mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. I'm really glad you recognized it, I whispered back, my heart swelling with an overwhelming, consuming tide of affection. I missed my best friend, she said softly, her breathing beginning to even out as sleep pulled her under. I'm glad she's back. She's never leaving again, I promised into the quiet room. I sat there watching her sleep as the morning light slowly filled the apartment, painting the walls in shades of gold and pink. The war was over. The secrets were entirely out in the open. But as I traced the soft curve of her jaw, a new, entirely different kind of realization settled over me. Monday was coming. We had to turn in a project that was essentially a thinly veiled confession of our deepest, most private emotions to Professor Harrison. And beyond that, we had to step out of this safe, insulated bubble of her apartment and navigate the real world, not just as childhood friends and not just as college classmates, but as something entirely new and beautifully terrifying. I leaned my head back against the couch cushions, closing my eyes. Clean slate was gone, but what we had written over it was infinitely better. End of Part 8. Part 9. The weekend existed in a beautiful, suspended state of suspended reality. For 2 full days, Emma and I barely left her apartment. We built a fortress out of unpacked cardboard boxes and cozy blankets, ordering entirely too much takeout and binge-watching terrible reality television. It was a crash course in rediscovering each other. We spent hours trading stories, filling in the massive 7-year gap in our lives. I learned about her favorite indie bands, her newfound love for iced Americanos, and the agonizingly slow decline of her mother's health. In return, I told her about my awkward high school years, the exact moment I decided to ditch my glasses for contacts, and how deeply I had missed her every single day. By the time Monday morning inevitably arrived, the absolute dread that usually accompanied my 9 a.m. alarm was completely gone. In its place was a buzzing, electric thrill. We walked into the advanced creative writing seminar together. Crisp autumn air had left a soft pink flush on Emma's cheeks, and she was wearing a vintage oversized sweater that kept slipping off one shoulder. Our fingers were loosely intertwined as we navigated the crowded lecture hall. A few students glanced our way, their eyes dropping to our joined hands, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The agonizing need to hide was over. We walked up to the 3rd row and took our usual seats. There was no laptop barricade this time. Instead, Emma instantly pulled her chair a few inches closer to mine, our knees brushing together under the desk. The physical contact sent a warm, grounding wave of comfort straight through my chest. All right, everyone, settle down, Professor Harrison announced, clapping his hands together as he walked up to the podium. Today is the day. Your midterm collaborative projects are due. I want a physical copy printed and placed on my desk before you leave today. I am incredibly eager to see how you navigated the treacherous waters of co-authorship. As I mentioned on day 1, writing with another person requires a profound level of vulnerability. You have to expose your own creative insecurities and merge them with someone else's. It is not an easy task. Emma turned her head, giving me a sideways glance. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. Treacherous waters was the understatement of the century. We had essentially waged psychological warfare on each other via Google Docs for an entire week before finally waving the white flag. I'm pretty sure our vulnerability went right off the charts, Emma whispered, leaning in so her breath tickled the shell of my ear. Do you think we'll get extra credit for resolving our childhood trauma in 72 hours? We better, I whispered back, a laugh bubbling up in my throat. I reached under the desk and found her hand, tangling our fingers together and resting them securely on my lap. If he gives us anything less than an A, I'm demanding a recount. When class ended, we walked up to the front of the hall. I placed our freshly printed manuscript, all 30 pages of our chaotic, beautiful, deeply personal story, onto Professor Harrison's desk. He looked at the title page, then looked up at us. His eyes flicked from my face to Emma's and then down to the tiny sliver of space between us, sensing the distinct shift in our dynamic. A small, subtle smile crinkled the corners of his eyes behind his glasses. I look forward to reading this, Olivia, Emma, he said, his tone carrying a distinct note of approval. Have a great week. We practically floated out of the academic building. Campus was bathed in bright, clear morning sunlight, the vibrant red and gold leaves falling like confetti around us. We headed straight for the roasted bean, taking our usual spot in the line. When it was our turn to order, Emma stepped up to the register. I'll have a large iced Americano, Emma told the barista, before turning her head to look at me with a mischievous glint in her emerald eyes. And she'll have a large hot chocolate, oat milk, dash of cinnamon, and exactly 2 pumps of vanilla. It's a very specific order. You can't mess it up. The barista blinked, amused by the instruction, but nodded and began tapping the screen. I felt my cheeks heat up, a deep, rosy flush spreading across my face. I bumped my shoulder against hers. You're never going to let me live that down, are you? I groaned playfully as we moved down the counter to wait for our drinks. Never, Emma laughed, stepping into my space and wrapping her arms around my waist from the side. She rested her chin on my shoulder, looking up at me through her eyelashes. It is the smoking gun of your criminal deception. But I'll admit, it's also incredibly endearing that you've kept the exact same sugar addiction since you were 10 years old. We grabbed our drinks and headed back toward the dormitories. It was time for the next major hurdle, officially introducing my childhood best friend turned girlfriend to my brutally honest roommate. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door to my room, Chloe was sitting at her desk, frantically highlighting a massive biology textbook. She spun around in her chair, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Emma and me standing in the doorway, our hands tightly laced together. Chloe stood up slowly, crossing her arms over her chest and narrowing her eyes in a terrifyingly accurate impression of a strict mother. So, Chloe said, her gaze landing squarely on Emma, you must be the girl who caused my roommate to have a complete and total existential crisis for the last 2 weeks. I winced. Chloe, please. No, she's right, Emma interrupted smoothly, stepping forward and holding out her free hand. She was completely unfazed by Chloe's intimidating posture. I'm Emma. And for the record, I also had an existential crisis. So we're entirely even on the emotional damage front. Chloe stared at Emma's outstretched hand for a long, tense moment before her stern expression completely dissolved into a bright, genuine grin. She took Emma's hand and shook it firmly. I like you, Chloe declared, nodding approvingly. Anyone who can keep Olivia on her toes is a winner in my book. But seriously, if you ever make her cry like that again, I know how to dispose of a body. I'm a biology major. I know chemicals. Noted, Emma laughed, raising her hands in surrender. I promise, the crying is over. From now on, it's strictly romantic comedies and excessive amounts of hot chocolate. The tension in the room vanished, replaced by an easy, comfortable banter. The 3 of us spent the next hour sitting on the floor, drinking our coffees and exchanging embarrassing stories. Chloe took great pleasure in recounting the time I accidentally dyed my hair a faint shade of green during freshman year, while Emma eagerly backed her up with tales of my terrible fashion choices in middle school. I sat there, sandwiched between my best friend and the girl I was hopelessly in love with, feeling entirely and completely whole. Later that evening, the vibrant energy of the day settled into a quiet, intimate calm. Emma and I were lying on my narrow dorm bed. It was a tight squeeze, forcing us to lie entirely tangled together, limbs intertwined under the heavy comforter. My laptop was resting on my stomach, playing a quiet indie movie, but neither of us was really watching it. Emma was tracing slow, lazy circles on my stomach with her fingertips, her head resting comfortably on my chest. Hey, Emma murmured, her voice soft and slightly hesitant, breaking the comfortable silence. Hum. I hummed, running my fingers gently through her thick chestnut hair. I was thinking about my mom today, she said quietly. My hand stopped moving for a fraction of a second before resuming its soothing rhythm. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, the lingering shadow of her grief stepping gently into the space between us. Yeah, I asked softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. What about her? Emma shifted slightly, propping her chin on my chest so she could look up into my eyes. Her emerald gaze was shadowed with a bittersweet, melancholic light. I was thinking about how much she loved you, Emma smiled, a fragile, watery expression. She always used to say that you were the grounding wire to my lightning storm. When things got really bad in California, when the depression took over and she couldn't get out of bed, she used to talk about our old house. She used to talk about how she missed looking out the kitchen window and seeing us running through the sprinklers. A heavy lump formed in my throat. I remembered Mrs. Davis's warm laugh, the way she always smelled like laundry detergent and baking vanilla, the way she used to bandage our scraped knees with unwavering patience. I missed her too, Emma, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. She was like a second mom to me. I know, Emma swallowed hard, a single tear escaping and catching in the soft glow of the laptop screen. I realized today that I'm finally happy again. For the first time since she died, I feel like I can actually breathe. I just wish she was here to see it. I wish she knew that I found my way back to you. She knows, I promised fiercely, pulling Emma up slightly so I could press my forehead against hers. I believe that, Emma. She knows you're safe. She knows we found each other again. Emma closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath that brushed against my lips. We stayed like that for a long time, holding space for the grief, honoring the memory of the woman who had packed that wooden box of Polaroids and letters, inadvertently guiding Emma back to me. Olivia, Emma whispered, her eyes fluttering open. The melancholy was still there, but it was anchored by a newfound, burning determination. Yeah, I want to go back, she said, her voice steady and resolute. Back where? I asked, slightly confused. Home, Emma replied, her fingers coming up to gently cup my jaw. I want to see our old street. I want to see if the oak tree we used to climb is still there. I've spent so long running away from the past because it hurt too much. But I don't want to run anymore. I want to merge it all together. The old us and the new us. Will you take me? My hometown was only a 2-hour drive from the university. I hadn't been back since the semester started, but the thought of walking down those familiar suburban sidewalks with Emma by my side sent a rush of adrenaline straight through my veins. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The ultimate closure. Of course, I smiled, a profound, overwhelming wave of love washing over me. I leaned in and kissed her, pouring every ounce of my heart into the connection. This weekend. We'll go home. End of Part 9. Part 10. The drive back to our hometown was a 2-hour journey through a canvas of brilliant autumn colors. The highway was lined with towering maple and oak trees, their leaves burning in vibrant shades of crimson, burnt orange, and gold. Inside the car, the heater was humming softly, competing only with the quiet acoustic playlist drifting from the speakers. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her bare feet propped up on the dashboard, her head resting against the cool glass of the window. Her left hand, however, was firmly anchored to my right hand, our fingers laced together over the center console. Every few miles, her thumb would gently trace the crescent moon scar on my wrist, a silent, comforting anchor that tethered us both to the present moment. Nervous? I asked softly, keeping my eyes on the road as we took the familiar exit off the interstate. Emma let out a long, slow exhale, turning her head to look at me. A little, she admitted, her emerald eyes reflecting the passing sunlight. It feels like we're driving into a time machine. I haven't seen this town since the day the moving truck pulled away. I'm terrified that it's going to look completely different, but I think I'm equally terrified that it's going to look exactly the same. It's a bit of both, I smiled reassuringly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. The old bakery on the corner turned into a corporate coffee shop, and they finally repaved Main Street, but the bones are the same. It's still the place we grew up. My parents were out of town for a medical conference in Chicago, which meant we had my childhood home entirely to ourselves for the weekend. It was the perfect setup. We didn't have to navigate the overwhelming chaos of parental introductions or polite small talk. We just had the space to breathe, to remember, and to finally close the loop. 10 minutes later, I turned the steering wheel, guiding my car onto Elmwood Drive. The immediate shift in Emma's posture was palpable. She sat up straight, pulling her feet off the dashboard, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the quiet, tree-lined suburban street. The houses here were deeply familiar, a row of two-story homes with manicured lawns and wide front porches. I pulled into the driveway of my house, a pale yellow colonial with white shutters. Right next door, separated only by a narrow strip of grass and a low wooden fence, stood Emma's old house. It had been painted a slate gray by the new owners, and the wild rose bushes her mother used to meticulously tend to had been replaced by neat, modern hedges. I put the car in park and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of 7 years of accumulated ghosts. Emma didn't move to unbuckle her seatbelt. She just sat there, staring blankly at the gray house next door. I watched a myriad of emotions wage war across her beautiful face. Profound grief, bitter nostalgia, and a lingering, fragile hope. I unbuckled my own seatbelt and reached across the console, gently cupping the side of her face. "Hey, I'm right here. We can just turn around and drive back to campus if this is too much. You don't have to do this today." Emma leaned into my palm, closing her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, the emerald green was bright with unshed tears, but her jaw was set with fierce determination. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. "I need to do this. I'm tired of running, Olivia." We got out of the car, the crisp afternoon breeze immediately biting at our cheeks. Instead of heading for my front door, we instinctively walked toward the narrow gap between the two houses. It was the exact path we used to run back and forth 100 times a day. We stopped right in the middle of the grass, standing between the yellow siding of my house and the gray siding of hers. We both looked up. There they were. The two second-story bedroom windows, perfectly aligned, facing each other across the gap. "The string is gone," Emma noted softly, a bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "My dad took it down the summer after you left," I admitted, wrapping my arm around her waist and pulling her close against my side. "He said it was a fire hazard, but I think he just couldn't stand watching me stare out that window waiting for a note that was never going to come." Emma rested her head on my shoulder, wrapping her arm around my back. "If I could go back in time, I would have tied 1,000 notes to that string, Ollie. I would have told you that California was too hot, that the kids at my new school were mean, and that I missed my best friend so much it physically hurt to breathe." "I know." I pressed a kiss to her temple, the familiar scent of vanilla and sandalwood wrapping around me like a protective blanket. "But we're here now. We don't need the string anymore." We stood there in the quiet space between our pasts for a long time, letting the autumn wind carry away the last lingering remnants of guilt and abandonment. "Come on," I finally whispered, gently tugging her hand. "There's one more place we need to go." I led her through the wooden side gate and into my sprawling backyard. The grass was covered in a thick blanket of fallen leaves, crunching loudly beneath our boots. The yard looked much smaller to me now as an adult, but the massive ancient oak tree standing proudly in the very back corner was just as imposing and magnificent as I remembered. Emma stopped dead in her tracks when she saw it. "It's still here," she breathed, her eyes tracing the thick, winding branches that stretched up toward the clear blue sky. "It survived," I nodded, walking with her until we were standing directly beneath its massive canopy. Emma reached out, her fingers gently brushing the rough, grooved bark of the trunk. She traced the shape of a lower branch, the exact branch I had slipped from all those years ago. She turned to me, her eyes dropping automatically to my left wrist. "I was so terrified that day," Emma confessed, her voice dropping into a raspy whisper. "When you fell and I saw the blood, I thought I had broken you. I felt so responsible." "You caught me, Emma," I corrected her gently, stepping into her space and taking both of her hands in mine. "I would have hit the ground a lot harder if you hadn't been there. You always caught me." Emma looked down at our joined hands, and then she let go of my right hand, reaching into the deep pocket of her vintage leather jacket. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was worn and slightly yellowed at the edges. "What is that?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "It's a letter," Emma said, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "My mom wrote it to me a few weeks before she passed away, but I didn't find it until I was packing up the apartment in California. I brought it with me because it felt like the only piece of her I had left." She carefully unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, a fresh tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. "She told me that she was sorry for taking me away from the only place I ever felt safe," Emma read aloud, her voice breaking. "She told me that grief is a heavy anchor, but love is the tide that eventually pulls you back to shore. And at the very end, she told me to go find my Ollie." The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. Tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, hot and fast. I stared at the girl in front of me, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer, devastating beauty of the universe's timing. "She knew," Emma sobbed quietly, clutching the letter to her chest. "She knew that I was never going to be whole until I found my way back to you. And I was so angry, Olivia. I was so angry at the world for taking her away, and I was so angry at myself for leaving you. But standing here right now, I finally understand." "Understand what?" I asked, reaching out to wipe the tears from her face with my thumbs, cradling her jaw with absolute, unconditional reverence. "That this was always supposed to be the ending," Emma whispered, looking up at me with a gaze so fiercely loving and intense it made my knees weak. "It wasn't a tragedy. It was just a really long detour. And I am finally home." I didn't need to hear another word. I pulled her in and crashed my lips against hers. It was a kiss that tasted of salt, nostalgia, and absolute undeniable permanence. We kissed under the golden canopy of the ancient oak tree, surrounded by the falling autumn leaves, entirely rewriting the history of this backyard. Pain of the past 7 years evaporated into the crisp air, leaving behind nothing but the overwhelming electric heat of our present. Emma's hands tangled fiercely in my hair, pulling me closer, as if she was trying to merge our very souls together. I wrapped my arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground, spinning her in a slow, breathless circle until she let out a bright, ringing laugh against my mouth. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. When we finally pulled apart, completely out of breath, we rested our foreheads together. Emma's eyes were shining, completely devoid of the heavy shadows of grief that had haunted her for months. She was radiant. She was my Emma, but she was also the breathtaking woman who had captivated me in a college lecture hall. We spent the rest of the weekend entirely wrapped up in each other. We built a fort in my old childhood bedroom, ordered pizza from the local parlor we used to frequent, and laid on the roof at midnight, pointing out constellations just like we did when we were kids. Only this time, there were no secrets. There were no boundaries. Just the terrifying, beautiful reality of two people who had finally found their way back to exactly where they belonged. A week later, we were back at Eastwood University, sitting in our usual seats in the third row of the Advanced Creative Writing Seminar. The chill of late autumn was setting in outside, but inside the lecture hall it was warm. I was wearing Emma's oversized band t-shirt, and she was wearing my sage green sweater. Our legs were pressed together beneath the desk, my fingers lazily tracing the silver rings on her hand. Professor Harrison walked down the aisle, handing back the graded midterm projects. He stopped at our desk, placing our manuscript down in front of us. He offered a small, knowing smile before walking back to the podium to begin his lecture. Emma and I both leaned in to look at the front page. Written in the top right corner in bold red ink was a massive A+. Beneath the grade, Professor Harrison had written a single handwritten note, a devastatingly beautiful exploration of vulnerability. Transition from deception to brutal honesty is a masterclass in character development. Some stories are worth burning the glass house down for. Emma let out a soft, triumphant laugh, turning her head to look at me. The emerald green of her eyes was entirely clear, sparkling with mischief and profound affection. "Well, partner," Emma whispered, leaning in so her lips brushed the shell of my ear, sending a familiar jolt of electricity straight down my spine. Looks like we passed the test. We did, I smiled, turning my head to capture her lips in a sweet, lingering kiss right there in the middle of the lecture hall. I didn't care who was watching. The ghost of the past was gone, the liar was dead, and the truth was infinitely better than any fiction we could have ever written. I looked into the eyes of my childhood best friend, my collaborator, and the absolute love of my life. So, I whispered against her mouth, what do we write next? Emma smiled, her fingers intertwining tightly with mine. Whatever we want. The rest of the pages are completely blank. End of part 10. Wow, just wow. Take a deep breath with me, everyone, because that was an absolute roller coaster of emotions. Welcome to the end of the video, and thank you so much for staying with me until the very last word. You're listening to your GL girlfriend, and we seriously need to debrief about what just happened between Olivia and Emma. Let's break this down. From the very first chapter, the tension was just off the charts. Can we talk about the sheer, absolute panic of sitting next to your childhood crush, realizing she has no idea who you are and just rolling with it? I think the most fascinating part of this entire story is the psychology behind Olivia's lie. Was she actually protecting Emma? Was she really trying to give her the blank slate she desperately needed to heal from her mother's passing? Or was Emma right when they fought in the apartment? Was Olivia just being a coward, terrified that the awkward, brace-faced Ollie from the past wasn't good enough for the cool, beautiful, leather jacket-wearing Emma of the present? Such a beautifully messy moral gray area, and it makes them feel so incredibly human. And can we please talk about the Google Doc scene? I mean, seriously, that has to be one of the most intense, passive-aggressive, yet deeply romantic ways to fight with someone. Writing a literal thriller novel together just to unpack your childhood trauma and confess your buried feelings? It's brilliant, it's angsty, and it is absolute peak WLW culture. Then, of course, the climax. The moment Emma recognized that crescent moon scar on Olivia's wrist, my heart literally stopped beating. The shift from that absolute crushing betrayal to the breathtakingly vulnerable confession in the dusty library archives was everything we could have hoped for. And going back to their hometown to stand under that same oak tree? Absolute cinematic perfection. The past and the present finally merged together. But enough of my analyzing, I want to have a real conversation with you guys. I have a few questions for you, and I want you to head down to the comments right now and tell me your honest thoughts. Question number 1. If you were in Olivia's shoes on that very first day in the lecture hall, what would you have done? Would you have immediately reached out and said, "Hey, it's me, Ollie," or would you have panicked and kept your identity a secret to get a fresh start? Question number 2. Do you think Emma forgave her too quickly in the library, or do you think their digital warfare in the shared document was exactly what they needed to clear the air? And finally, what was your absolute favorite moment in the story? Was it the almost kiss in the kitchen while making garlic bread, the emotional library confession, or getting the final A+ from Professor Harrison? Let me know down below in the comments. I read every single one, and I absolutely love seeing how you guys interpret these characters and their choices. If this story made your heart flutter, if it made you stress sweat, or if it just made your day a little bit better, please do me a massive favor. Hit that like button right now, it really helps the channel out more than you know. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another upload. I am working on so many fresh, exciting, and heart-melting GL stories, and you definitely want to be part of this family. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and for supporting the channel. You guys are the absolute best. This is your GL girlfriend signing off. I will see you all in the next video. Bye.